So, at long last, after repeating it like a mantra for months on end, the prophecy has finally come to pass. Deltarune tomorrow. Or probably like a month ago by the time I finished this. Even though we're only halfway through, Deltarune is an undeniable masterpiece already, cementing its place alongside the likes of Chrono Trigger and Earthbound among the all-time classic RPGs. It's so deeply evocative, and that's thanks in large part to its cast, all of whom are beautifully written. Even the goofy characters, who largely exist to be comic reliefs like Queen and Burley, are deeply compelling in their own rights. The cherry on top of the fact that these are just genuinely super strong characters is that the majority of the main cast is canonically queer. It really is so cool to see such a mainstream game, and such a fantastic one at that, champion a cast of characters that represent my community so well. Chris is the only video game protagonist I know of who's not just canonically trans, but not binary trans. Actually, maybe that non-binary alien is, I'm not sure.
So, I'm non-binary.
I don't know what game this is from, but I think about this video so often. To sweeten the deal even further, these characters aren't just queer, but their queerness is thematically relevant. Chris's gender, or lack thereof, plays off of our assumption about video game protagonists. We often assume androgynous protagonists in games are androgynous for the benefit of the audience, so we can more easily project our own genders onto them. But Chris is their own person. They aren't androgynous for our sake, they're non-binary because that's who they are, and it's not up to us to force our identity onto them. Nevertheless, people still insist their gender is up for interpretation despite that literally being one of the biggest plot threads of the game, but oh well. There's a really good video by Mooey Mushroom more deeply analyzing Chris and why them being non-binary is relevant to Deltarune's overall narrative. While I think many Deltarune fans can agree that Chris's gender is thematically relevant, I think there's another character whose queerness can inform the overall themes that I don't think has been touched on much, that being Noelle, potentially the most gay character ever. I think Noelle being a lesbian, like Chris being non-binary, is actually pretty relevant, especially to the weird route and the potential idea of the prophecy and its subversion, and thematically ties back to this game's huge themes of identity and freedom. So in celebration of Pride Month, which may or may not be over by now, and Deltarune being out, let's have a look at Noelle, her gayness, and why that matters to the overall story of Deltarune. So, it's no secret that Noelle, like the rest of the main cast, is restricted by a lack of agency. Her main arc in Chapter 2 is developing from her learned helplessness. Queen is very clearly a stand-in for Carol, a maternal figure who, while genuinely caring for Noelle and loving her, is also overly strict and controlling of her and her life. Queen probably also represents the respective mothers of the rest of the Lightners, but that's a conversation for another day. The thing is, though, Noelle doesn't actually take a stand against Queen until the very end, resulting in Susie thinking that she actually is on Queen and Birdley's side. Her line in the roller coaster scene is pretty on the nose in this regard. She quite literally couldn't say no. It's only through her adventures in the Dark World that Noelle learns to stand up for herself, and a lot of that is thanks to Susie. For a more in-depth analysis of Suselle, I recommend Stuffed Alpaca's video, which I will link in the iCard, but suffice it to say, regardless of what annoying people on Reddit will say, Susie and Noelle are good for each other. They complete each other. Noelle is, as Susie so eloquently put it, top shelf, but she's also kind of a doormat, whereas Susie is angsty and rebellious, and to an extent goes out of her way to defy authority that isn't Toriel. They clearly have a lot to learn from each other. In Chapter 4, this is emphasized even further in the Light World, with Noelle very begrudgingly accepting Birdley's festival invitation and Susie then saying what she definitely wanted to say. Susie straight up says here that Noelle has to learn not to take things standing down. It's not exactly subtle. And I think it's also important that Susie so blatantly stands up to Carol in this scene. Carol is untouchable, not just by Noelle, but by most of the town, and it makes sense. She's a very intimidating woman, but Susie is just completely unbothered by her. While I doubt that this made Carol less mad, especially because she was probably more worried about the guitar than anything, it showed Noelle that her mom isn't an untouchable god. She doesn't have to take things sitting down, she can use her voice, like she does with Queen at the end of Chapter 2. These two are crucial to their respective arcs. Speaking of which, I want to talk about gender, sexuality, and fate. Something that always struck me is that all the Fun Gang are gender non-conforming in some way. Ralse is traditionally feminine, with the later color scheme, support role, and more traditionally feminine hobbies like baking, sewing, and singing. Susie is more masculine, with the edgier aesthetic and role of the party's tank. And Chris is, of course, not aligned with either binary gender presentation. Initially, I thought nothing of this. Toby Fox just likes putting queer characters in his games, but I was discussing it with a friend, and I think it's actually pretty relevant to this game's themes of destiny. Cishet society would have us believe that our birth sex is our destiny. We're sent on this unchanging path as soon as we're born, and there's certain things that come with that. If you're born a girl, you'll stay a girl, and you will like pink and dolls and be emotional and submissive and be attracted to boys. If you are born a boy, you will like blue, and you will kick the ball and be a stoic asshole and like girls. Of course, though, things aren't nearly that rigid in reality. You don't have to fall in line with the traditional norms for your birth gender, and you don't even have to be that gender at all. It figures then that Susie and Ralsei, who are most actively invested in stopping the prophecy from coming to pass, don't align with their expected gender identities. After all, Susie is very much not the type of person to let fate hold her down, let alone something as socially constructed as gender roles. And with that said, I think it's interesting that the prophecy is the town's religion. For a long time, and I believe most of the fandom, assumed that the prophecy was foretold by Gaster and given to Ralsei, given the whole time and space thing, but no, it's something that most of the townspeople are probably aware of already. That's honestly a fascinating choice to me for a couple of reasons. For one, as I said, this means the prophecy isn't necessarily a machination of Gaster or some other omniscient being. It's not that that couldn't be the case, and it probably still is, to be honest, but if this is to be compared to real-life religion, then it too is a social construct, one that doesn't hold any more fundamental weight than girls being associated with pink and boy with blue. For another, it's not exactly a revolutionary take to say that a lot of modern gender expectations are derived from religion. I'm not saying that the angel religion has sexist or homophobic beliefs in its scripture, by the way. Noelle, Alphys, Undyne, and those gay-ass royal guards are all part of the congregation, which would be pretty weird otherwise. But I think it is an interesting choice nonetheless, and it's not uncommon for Toby to use the language of the real world to communicate symbolic ideas within his worlds, even if the associated stigmas aren't diegetically true. Like, take Chris being non-binary again, for example. While I don't think that within the town anyone is transphobic to Chris, it conveys to us in real life who know that non-binary people do stand out and are discriminated against, that Chris feels like the odd one out in their town. Anyway, tangent over. This is all to say that with the prophecy revealed to be the religion, Susie is potentially just defying a social construct. That statement is also true of her gender nonconformity. Hell, the game directly connects these concepts when Ralsei says that Susie is supposed to be the party member who wears ribbons. If the prophecy really does outline every single beat as Ralsei says, then she's already going off script by refusing to wear traditionally girly accessories. This is off the cuff, but I just remembered that when Susie is comforting Tenna, she makes specific mention of just needing to find your people. And if you've ever been a lonely queer kid, then you've almost definitely been given that advice before. Which is very true. Community is so important when you're a queer kid. So again, we see the game covertly connecting the concept of these characters finding solace and a sense of belonging with their queerness. But what does this all have to do with Noelle? Well, Noelle isn't really gender non-conforming, at least to our knowledge, though I will say her room's color palette is a bit sus. But what I just went over set the precedent that queerness is linked to defying destiny, and as I established, Noelle's arc is all about her learning not to accept things sitting down. This is a transitive a property of equality and a half thing right here, but Noelle being gay is associated with her relationship with Susie, and Susie teaches her not to take things sitting down. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little about the weird route. Preemptive warning for any Chris L shippers, I'm sorry, but I will kind of be dumping on your ship in this section. I'm not saying you're not allowed to ship it, or that you're, like, problematic or whatever if you do, but the fact of the matter is most of the canon content implying it does come from the weird route, so yeah. So if the normal route is all about Noelle finding a sense of agency and learning not to be a doormat, then the weird route seems to be the antithesis of that. I remember after Chapter 2 initially came out, there was some discussion about whether weird route Noelle was truly stronger. After all, taken on its own, Noelle is presumed to have learned the same lesson, the weird route just scared her into it. However, with the advent of Chapter 4, I don't think this is really the case, and a large part of that is eroding Noelle's sense of self, including her sexuality. If you somehow hadn't picked up on them, the Weird Route has a lot of romantic undertones. One of the Weird Route specific interactions involves this Ferris wheel poster, something explicitly associated with romance. You have to tell the Addison that you and Noelle are something else in order to progress, and the whole ring stuff invokes wedding imagery. Additionally, a very valid interpretation of Hyperlink Blocked is that it's love. Not only is it a double entendre, also alluding to level of violence, it's also very in character for Spamton to be so crass to say that Noelle and Chris were making love. He also straight up calls her a hoochie mama, so again, that's kind of feeding into the misogynistic undertones going on here. I also just remembered that if you talk to the philosopher in Chapter 4, they will ask if Chris has heard of Hyperlink Blocked, and one of the spare dialogues is the answer is love, so I guess that kind of seems to settle that. Also, I find it worth noting that at least near the start, Noelle is clearly not into any of the romantically coded options. When you first offer to ride the Ferris wheel with her, she's uninterested because Chris is a little shit, and she only accepts when it's made into a statement and she's scared into it. Noelle will ride with me, it wasn't a question. She She also says that there's no good interpretation when you tell the Addison that Chris and Noelle are something else, and if you abort the rat here, she'll think about getting the ring for Susie. Again, this is implying that Noelle is not just ambivalent to romance with Chris, she's actively against the idea of it. It's only once Noelle starts gaslighting herself about everything that happens that she becomes receptive to our love. While we're on this topic, I feel it's important to address an elephant that's been poking its head into the room. Initially, I felt weird about saying that Chris and Noelle's relationship in the Weird Route is kind of heterosexual coded, because that feels like I'm masculinizing Chris, which is the last thing I want to do. Lesbians who date non-binary people are still very much lesbians. However, I then realized that's exactly the point. As I said earlier, Chris plays off of audience expectations for an androgynous video game character. We often assume that androgynous protagonists exist for us to project onto, but Chapter 1 ends with Chris very clearly asserting that no, they are not our plaything, they're their own person who independently identifies as non-binary. I also can't help but think that basing Mantle, which is directly tied to the Weird Route, so heavily on The Legend of Zelda was a deliberate choice in this regard, since Link is a perfect example of the aforementioned archetype. While Noelle is the primary victim of the Weird Route, Chris is also a victim of it and suffers the same erosion of identity. If we weren't already depersonalizing Chris, we sure as hell are in the Weird Route, where their contempt for us is made incredibly clear. We're forcing Chris to become us, even more in this route, forcing them to walk our bloody path, and oftentimes that means making them to a cishet boy, regardless of how they feel about it. We're putting them into that Link box of being an androgynous puppet for us to manipulate, not letting them be their own thing. So yes, this is to say that not only is Noelle being heterofied by the Weird Route, Chris is being sissified. Actually, I don't think I should call it that. After all, it is kind of hard for a girl to be straight if her love interest isn't a guy. Generally, I don't like an interpretation that assumes Chris's birth sex, but Toby is surely aware that the majority of people who don't know or care that Chris is non-binary assume that they're a boy. Like the No Mercy route before it, the Weird Route plays off of our expectations for a traditional RPG and video games in general, assuming this heteronormative and cisnormative attitude. This isn't assuming Chris's birth sex, it's assuming that we assume Chris's birth sex. So, in the Weird Route, in which we heterofy Noelle, she loses most of, if not all of the major scenes in which she learns to stand up for herself. She never defies Queen, Susie never yells at Birdley on her behalf, and she never sees Susie argue with Carol. I find it meaningful that Susie directly instigates the former events, again reinforcing the idea that Noelle's relationship with Susie, and by extension her being a lesbian, is necessary for Noelle's actualization. I also just remembered that Noelle standing up to Queen was because of Susie specifically being in danger. So again, in a way, her presence kind of instigated that. In fact, since Birdley is out of commission in the Weird Route, Carol is instead the one who calls Noelle in this scene, the character who embodies the oppressive forces in Noelle's life, but we'll get back to Carol later. Instead, we get this scene, which is probably the most viscerally harrowing moment in the entire game so far. Brief content warning for discussion of sexual assault here. If you want to skip past, here's the timestamp. Honestly, I don't think it's out of line for this scene to be interpreted as comparable to SA. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that it's supposed to be literal SA happening here. That would be incredibly extreme even for this game, but the thematic parallels are absolutely there. We corner Noelle and violate her boundaries in an incredibly visceral way, and forcibly penetrate her with a sharp object. If anything, I think the rose visual was removed because it was too on the nose and people interpreted it as actual violence that was happening, which I definitely don't think is the case. The glass-shattering imagery also gets a similar concept though, Noelle's spirit being broken or her innocence being lost in a way. Nevertheless, this is all in line with Noelle and Chris's relationship in the Weird Route being likened to an abusive, heterosexual core marriage. We're essentially mashing them together like Barbie dolls, except the Barbies in question are alive and unwilling participants. Speaking of which, I want to mention the final scene of the Chapter 4 Weird Route. Carol calls Chris and asks if they're going to the festival before telling them that Noelle is looking forward to seeing them, which is very ominous given the events of the day. And because of this, I think that Carol's role in the Weird Route symbolically needs to be acknowledged. I want to preface this by saying that I am the #1 Carol defender, and I think it's really unreasonable that people are acting like she's Satan for being honestly justifiably rude in the one scene we've seen her in. I sincerely doubt Toby would make an antagonist who's just unequivocally evil. That kind of goes against Undertale's entire philosophy. However, it is clear that Carol is representative of the oppressive forces in Noelle's life, and that feels applicable to the Weird Route. Carol's framing of Noelle going with Chris feels ambivalent if not actively supportive. She even went out of her way to call Chris about it to make sure it was happening. And I find it relevant that the Susie split screen is also removed in this version of events. It's kind of implying that she's out of the picture now. I was talking to my friend as I wrote this, and he described it as arranged marriage core, and I think that is a good way to put it. While Chris is colluding with Carol, they're not on board with her schemes, at least not entirely, as she seems to be wielding something probably related to deaths going missing over their head. They're also a puppet for her. I can't help but feel like this also indicates Carol's conflation of us with Chris. After all, why would we always be welcome when Carol and Chris just spent the past hour on a wild goose chase to stop us from rooting around? It figures then that if Noelle and Chris's depersonalization is tied to cis-hedifying them, and Carol is also invested in controlling Chris and Noelle, yeah, of course she'd be on the heterosexual Deltarune. This is also supported by Queen taking a special interest in Chris and Noelle, and not so much Susie, Ralsei, and Birdley. Again, it really feels like we're smashing Chris and Noelle together like Barbies in this route, based on the traditional adventure story paradigm. Childhood friends, heterosexual couple, Chris is the link to Noelle's Zelda. It feels so by the numbers. And ultimately, I think that's going to be the great irony of the weird route. In our desperate quest for freedom, our desperate attempt to shed the fetters of the prophecy, we ended up creating our own prophecy. The weird route does go off script, sure, but the steps to instating it are so obscure and specific that we're still marching a predestined path. Chris is the dark bead, broken off, but still locked. We're forcing this traditional RPG paradigm onto Chris and Noelle, forcing them to be things they aren't. And, I don't know. If you're a queer kid, being forced to act in a way that you don't identify with and love people you don't love probably sounds familiar. But no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you try to bury it and torment yourself into ignoring it, who you are and who you love are written in truth. Written somewhere no one can erase. Thank you all so much for watching. I know this one was a bit shorter than usual, but I really wanted to strike while the Deltarune iron was hot and also try to get it out during Pride Month. Sadly, I don't think that the latter goal will be attainable, but it'll probably be close enough, whatever. Probably. Noelle has been one of my biggest comfort characters ever since Chapter 2 first came out, and with the Deltarune parasite once again consuming my brain, I finally felt the need to talk about this silly deer to my audience of thousands. This is definitely not the last time I'll be talking about Deltarune between now and before Chapter 5 comes out, so stay tuned for more analysis of this kind. I may even do a brief Undertale/Deltarune version of Fandom Follies because, oh boy. However, as you all probably know, there was another relevant release recently, and that will take precedent since I'm a FNAF person first and foremost. Secret of the Mimic honestly blew my expectations out of the water. I didn't expect to enjoy it nearly as much as I did, but it's probably among my top 3 FNAF games now. It has also brought to the surface a point of discourse that's been stewing in the back of my mind for a while now that snuck its way into some of my other videos already, but it's reached a boiling point, so I think it deserves its own dedicated video at last. Other than that though, that is all I have for you today. Thank you all so much for the support on my last video. I'm honestly kind of blown away by it, and I'm also pleasantly surprised that there's been some very constructive discussion happening in the comments. I honestly thought that most of the comments would be like, nuh-uh, it's absolute cinema or whatever, and while I've definitely had my fair share of those, it seems like a lot of actual thoughtful commentary and critique are being brought to the top, which I really enjoy. If you want to support me, leaving a like or a comment means a lot, and you might even subscribe if you're feeling a little frisky. I also have a Ko-Fi if you'd rather cut out the middleman. But other than that, I love you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.